January 6, 1944. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. The air in the office was thick with the unspoken tension of a command in crisis. Major General Jimmy Doolittle, his face, a mask of determined focus, stood on the cold linoleum floor of Major General William Kepner's office. Kepner commanded the 8th Fighter Command, a force of young men being fed into a meat grinder with no end in sight. But it wasn't the maps on the wall or the reports on the desk that held Doolittle's attention. It was a sign hung with pride above Kepner's desk, its block letters a testament to a failing philosophy. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle read it once, his eyes narrowing. He read it a second time, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He turned to Kepner, his voice low but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "That sign needs to come down," he said. "It is wrong." Within hours, that simple, noble-sounding creed was gone. In its place, a new directive, a declaration of total war that would echo from the skies over Berlin to the halls of the German High Command. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. This single change, this redefinition of purpose, would not just alter tactics, it would unleash a fury that would systematically annihilate the German Luftwaffe in less than 6 months. What bomber crews would initially call a suicide order and what seasoned commanders saw as a reckless abandonment of their primary duty was in fact the master stroke that broke the deadlock in the skies over Europe. But to understand the genius of this gamble, you first have to understand the sheer soul-crushing horror of the reality it was born from. You have to go back 84 days to a sky clotted with flak and swarming with wolves, to a day the 8th Air Force would forever know as Black Thursday. October 14, 1943, 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses lumbered toward the German city of Schweinfurt, a target so vital its name had become a curse. The ball-bearing plants there were the heart of the Nazi war machine, and America was determined to rip it out. They reached the target. They dropped their bombs with lethal precision, but the journey home was a descent into hell. German fighters, unopposed by American escorts, who had long since turned back at the limit of their fuel, tore into the formations with methodical savagery. For hours, the radio channels were a cacophony of terror cries for help, the chilling silence of a crew going down the steady, horrifying count of parachutes against a smoke-filled sky. That afternoon, 60 American bombers, 60 flying steel coffins, never made it back. 600 men, sons, husbands, and brothers vanished from the earth. That night, 600 empty bunks in the Nissen huts across England stood as silent monuments to a strategy that was bleeding the 8th Air Force to death. The mathematics were inescapable. To complete a combat tour, a crewman had to survive 25 missions. On Black Thursday, your chance of returning from one mission was less than 80%. The odds were not just bad, they were a statistical death sentence, and every man knew it. The very foundation of the Allied strategy in Europe, the strategic daylight bombing campaign, was on the verge of total collapse, broken by the tactical brilliance and ferocity of the German fighter arm. The crisis demanded a solution. What it got was Jimmy Doolittle, and he was about to prove that the only way to save the sheep was to unleash the wolves. To understand how this one order rewrote the rules of aerial combat and broke the back of the Luftwaffe, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss a single part of this incredible story. To truly grasp the German confidence that Doolittle was about to shatter, one must descend into the frozen hell of 3,000 feet inside a B-17. It's a world of numbing cold, the air so thin, it's a whisper of life sustained only by a rubber hose and a rattling oxygen regulator. It is a symphony of noise, the monotonous roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines, the crackle of the intercom, and the constant, unnerving vibration that shudders through the aluminum skin. For the waist gunners exposed to the elements through open windows, the wind chill plunges to 60 below zero. Their electrically heated suits are their only shield against a cold that can freeze flesh in minutes. And through this brutal environment, they watch. They watch the horizon, their eyes scanning for the black specks that mean the shepherds have gone and the wolves are coming. On Black Thursday, those specks appeared with terrifying punctuality. From the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Heinz Noack saw the American bomber stream not as a formation of brave men, but as a mathematical problem to be solved. His Sturm Group was a specialized tool, his FOR 190, a flying cannon platform, its wings burdened with extra armor and 2 massive 30mm cannons. His job was not elegant dogfighting. It was industrial-scale destruction. He saw the B-17 seconds, the Wehrmachts flying in their carefully designed combat boxes, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, meant to create a web of interlocking fire. But Noak and his comrades had solved that geometry. The answer was speed and overwhelming firepower delivered from the one angle the bombers were most vulnerable, straight on. The attack begins miles away, a perfectly coordinated ballet of death. The German fighters form up a line abreast, climbing to gain an altitude advantage. The command comes over the radio, Angriff, marsch, marsch. Inside the B-17, the call from the nose gunner is a spike of adrenaline in the chest. Bandits 12 o'clock high. Every man tenses. The gunners swing their heavy Brownings forward, the barrels heavy and slow in the freezing air. They see them now, a line of black dots growing with impossible speed. The closing velocity is over 600 miles per hour. 1,000 feet per second. There is no time for thought, only for instinct honed by terror. The German fighters open fire from 1,000 yards out, their heavy cannon shells, visible as glowing orange spheres arcing through the sky. The American gunners reply, their 50 calibers hammering, sending streams of tracers out into the void, a desperate attempt to create a wall of lead. But at this speed, deflection shooting is nearly impossible. For the German pilot, the B-17's cockpit swells in his gun sight. He holds the trigger down a 2-second burst. The 30mm shells, each the size of a milk bottle, tear through the bomber's nose. One moment, there is a cockpit with 2 pilots fighting for their lives. The next, there is only a red mist and a shredded tangle of aluminum. Noak pulls up hard, flashing through the formation. The B-17, he just killed, already starting its long, spiraling fall to earth. For the men in the surviving bombers, it's a vision of their own mortality. They have just watched 10 of their friends cease to exist in the time it takes to draw a breath. And the German fighters are already wheeling around for another pass. This was the brutal, efficient slaughterhouse that the Luftwaffe had perfected. They were the masters of their sky, and they believed their dominance was absolute. They had no idea that their very success was forging the weapon that would lead to their own extinction. In his headquarters, General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, studied the kill reports from Black Thursday with grim satisfaction. Galland was a warrior aristocrat, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War with over 100 aerial victories, and he understood air combat better than anyone in the Third Reich. The numbers confirmed his strategy. American losses were unsustainable. The daylight bombing campaign was a bleeding wound, and his fighters were the salt. German industry, masterfully organized by Armaments Minister Albert Speer, was performing miracles. Despite Allied bombing, fighter production was soaring. In October 1943, over 1200 Messerschmitt 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds rolled off the assembly line. For every fighter the Americans could field over Germany, Galland could field 2, and his were flown by men defending their own homes, their motivation absolute. This confidence permeated the ranks. German pilots who had cut their teeth over Poland, France, the Channel, and the endless Eastern Front were the most experienced combat aviators in the world. They had developed a tactical doctrine that was ruthlessly effective. The Sturmböcke, the heavily armed 190 seconds, would handle the bombers. The lighter, more nimble Bf 109 seconds would act as their own escorts, tying up the American P-47 seconds and P-38 seconds, luring them into turning fights where the German fighters excelled. It was a perfect system, and it was working. But beneath the veneer of success, a cancer was growing, a disease that production numbers couldn't cure. Galland saw it, but was powerless to stop it. Germany was running out of pilots. Not just bodies to put in cockpits, but experienced men, the Experten, the irreplaceable core of veteran leaders who knew how to lead a squadron into battle and bring it home. Every mission, a few more of these veterans failed to return. Men like Hauptmann Hans Wachem, Jabs, or Major Heinz Baer, men who were living legends. When they died, they took with them thousands of hours of combat wisdom. The replacements arriving at the front were a different breed. In 1941, a Luftwaffe pilot received over 250 hours of flight training before seeing combat. By late 1943, that had been slashed to 160 hours, and it was falling fast. Fuel for training was being rationed. Ammunition for gunnery practice was scarce. Feldwebel Josef Zwernemann, an ace with 126 victories, wrote in his diary after a mission in November, "The new boys are cannon fodder. They fly their machines like they are still in school. They break formation at the first sign of trouble. They cannot see the enemy until it is too late. I spend more time protecting my own wingman than fighting the Americans. The Luftwaffe was becoming a hollow force. It had a hard, brilliant cutting edge of veterans, but the shaft of the spear was made of green wood, ready to snap under pressure. Gallen knew that if the Americans ever found a way to systematically target his veterans, to force them into a relentless battle of attrition day after day, his entire force would collapse. It was a prospect too terrible to contemplate, a possibility so remote it seemed like a bad dream. After all, the American fighters were still tied to the bombers, forced to fight on German terms in a defensive posture that ceded the initiative. They were shepherds, and as long as they remained shepherds, the wolves would continue to feast. For the American fighter pilots of the 8th Air Force, the winter of 1943 was a season of profound and bitter frustration. They were warriors trapped in the role of bodyguards, their aggressive instincts chained by a doctrine that felt like a betrayal of their very purpose. Men like Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group flying the massive P-47 Thunderbolt, or Major Jack Ilfrey of the 20th Fighter Group in the twin-boom P-38 Lightning were some of the finest pilots in the world. They had trained for years mastering aircraft that were powerful, rugged, and heavily armed. They had come to England to kill German fighters, to sweep the skies clean. Instead, they found themselves flying in tight, restrictive patterns around the lumbering bomber formations, like anxious sheepdogs circling a flock. The mission briefings were always the same. Stay with the bombers. Your primary job is to protect the heavies. Do not get lured away. Do not pursue. For a fighter pilot, these orders were poison. Their entire being screamed to attack, to seek out the enemy and destroy him. Yet they were forced to wait, to react, to watch as German fighters massed just out of range, dictating the time and place of every engagement. The most agonizing moment of any long-range mission was the point of no return, a pre-calculated spot on the map of Germany where the escort fighters, their fuel gauges dipping toward empty, had to break off. They would waggle their wings in a gesture of grim farewell to the bomber crews and turn for home, leaving the big friends to face the heart of the German defenses alone. Captain Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, a man whose aggression was legendary, described the feeling in a letter home. We turn back and it feels like we're running away. We can hear them on the radio, the bomber boys calling out bandits, fighting for their lives, and we're flying in the opposite direction. We see the German fighters climbing to meet them, and there isn't a damn thing we can do about it. We have the planes, we have the guns, we have the will, we just don't have the gas. This defensive mindset led to tactical absurdities. Fighter groups were assigned to specific bomber boxes, often unable to help an adjacent group being decimated because it would mean leaving their own charges unprotected. They were tethered, and the Germans held the other end of the leash. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast of a machine, a juggernaut that could dive faster than anything in the sky and absorb incredible punishment. But it was thirsty. The P-38 Lightning had 2 engines and long range, but it was vulnerable, its liquid-cooled engines susceptible to a single lucky shot. Neither was the perfect solution. The American pilots fought with courage and skill, and they shot down many German fighters, but they were always on the back foot, always reacting. They were winning battles, but they were losing the war of attrition because the Germans could always afford to trade a fighter for a B-17 packed with 10 men. The frustration in the ready rooms and officers' clubs across England was a palpable thing. Pilots knew they were better. They knew their planes were good. They just needed to be set free. They needed a weapon that could go all the way, a sword with the reach to strike the enemy's heart. And as the first bitter winds of 1944 began to blow, a new shape began to appear on the airfields of East Anglia. It was sleek, silver, and it whispered a promise of vengeance. It arrived not with a thunderous roar, but with the refined growl of a thoroughbred. The North American P-51 Mustang was more than just another airplane. It was an aeronautical masterpiece, a confluence of British ingenuity and American industrial might that created arguably the most perfect piston-engine fighter of the Second World War. Its origins were humble. North American Aviation had designed it in 1940 for the British, who needed fighters, any fighters, to supplement their Spitfires and Hurricanes. The early models powered by an American Allison engine were good at low altitudes, but asthmatic in the thin air of high-altitude combat where the war was being fought. The plane was a brilliant airframe in search of a soul, and it found that soul in a marriage of convenience that would change history. The British, in a stroke of genius, decided to install their own legendary engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, into a Mustang airframe. The result was transformative. It was like putting a race car engine into a pickup truck body. Suddenly, the Mustang could not just fly at high altitude, it could dominate. The American Packard Motor Company was licensed to mass-produce the Merlin engine, solving the production problem. The resulting aircraft, the P-51B, was a revelation. Its heart was the Packard V1650, a two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine that could produce over 1700 horsepower. This wasn't just raw power, it was smart power. The two-stage supercharger acted like a transmission for the atmosphere, allowing the engine to breathe efficiently both in the thick air near the ground and the rarefied air of the stratosphere. The Mustang could climb like a rocket, and at 30,000 feet was faster than any German fighter. Its wings were a marvel of aerodynamic design, using a laminar flow airfoil that dramatically reduced drag, giving it exceptional speed and fuel efficiency. But the final piece of the puzzle, the key that unlocked its true potential, was brutally simple: external drop tanks. Two streamlined aluminum tanks, one tucked under each wing, could carry an additional 150 gallons of fuel. This simple addition extended the Mustang's combat radius to over 800 miles. It could fly from England to Berlin, fight for 30 minutes over the target, and fly back with fuel to spare. There was no longer any place in the Third Reich a bomber could go that the Mustang could not follow. Pilots who transitioned from the heavy P-47 seconds or the quirky P-38 seconds fell in love instantly. Captain Chuck Yeager, then a young pilot with the 357th Fighter Group, described his first flight. "You didn't feel like you were sitting in a machine. The plane became an extension of your own body. You thought of a maneuver, and the Mustang was already doing it. It had speed, it had legs, and in a dogfight, it could turn with anything. We finally had a horse we could ride all the way to the finish line." By December 1943, the P-51 seconds were arriving in England in significant numbers. The 8th Air Force now possessed the perfect weapon, the silver bullet that could solve the range problem. But as the new year dawned, that perfect weapon was still being used in the same flawed way, tethered to the bombers, forced into a defensive crouch. Having the deadliest sword in the world means nothing if your strategy dictates that you can only use it as a shield. The crisis wasn't just about technology anymore, it was about imagination, and the man who had just taken command was about to provide it in spades. To condemn the old doctrine as simple foolishness is to misunderstand the minds that created it. Major General Ira Eaker, the man who built the 8th Air Force from scratch, was a visionary and a true believer. He was a bomber man, a disciple of the pre-war Air Corps Tactical School, which preached a near-religious faith in the power of the heavy bomber. Their core belief, forged in the 1,930 seconds, was that the bomber will always get through. They envisioned armadas of flying fortresses so heavily armed and flying in such precise formations that their combined defensive firepower would create an impenetrable box of machine gun fire. In this vision, fighters were a secondary concern, a helpful supplement, but not an essential component for survival. This theory wasn't born of arrogance, but of the technological limitations of the time. In the 1,930 seconds, no fighter had the range to escort a bomber on a deep penetration mission. Therefore, the bombers had to be able to defend themselves. The entire design of the B-17 with its 10 to 13 by 50 caliber machine guns was a testament to this philosophy. Eaker and his commanders had seen this doctrine work to a degree in the early raids of 1,942 and 1,943 against targets in France and the Low Countries. The bombers took losses, but they got through and came back. The combat box they believed was the answer. So when long-range fighters like the P-47 and P-38 finally became available, they were naturally integrated into this bomber-centric worldview. Their job was to plug the gaps in the bomber's defensive screen to ward off attackers, to act as a close-in bodyguard. The idea of sending these precious assets roving far from the bombers seemed like a dereliction of duty. To a man like Kepner, whose sign hung on the wall bringing the bombers back alive wasn't just a motto, it was a sacred trust. He saw the faces of the bomber crews before every mission. He knew the odds they faced. His every instinct told him that keeping the fighters close, where the crews could see them, was the only moral and tactical choice. What they failed to see was that the Germans had adapted. The Luftwaffe wasn't attacking the combat box head-on in a fair fight. They were exploiting its weaknesses. They attacked in waves from angles that overwhelmed the gunners. They developed weapons like air-to-air rockets that could be fired from outside the effective range of the 50 calibers. The combat box was no longer a fortress. It was a shooting gallery. The American doctrine was fundamentally reactive. It surrendered the initiative to the enemy. It allowed German commanders like Galland to choose the time, place, and method of attack every single time. The American fighters, superior in many ways, were forced to wait for the first punch, and by the time they could respond, a dozen bombers might already be falling from the sky. The strategy was failing not because the men were not brave or the planes were not good, but because the underlying philosophy was obsolete. It was a theory conceived in peacetime that was being disproven daily in the brutal laboratory of war. The entire command structure was trapped in a defensive mindset. It would take an outsider, a man unburdened by the bomber-centric dogma, to see the simple, brutal truth that had been staring them in the face all along. When Jimmy Doolittle walked out of Kepner's office on January 6th, he hadn't just ordered a sign to be changed. He had detonated a philosophical bomb in the heart of the 8th Air Force. The memo that followed his visit was concise, unambiguous, and for many terrifying. Fighter groups were no longer tethered. They were to rendezvous with the bombers and then, if not engaged, proceed to the target sweeping in advance of the bomber stream. After the target, they were free to strafe targets of opportunity on their way home. The leash was cut. The wolves were unchained. The reaction was immediate and polarized. In the fighter group ready rooms, the news spread like wildfire. For pilots like Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group or Hub Zemke of the 56th, it was the moment they had been praying for. The frustration that had been simmering for months erupted into elation. They were finally being allowed to do their job, to take the fight to the enemy. Blakesley gathered his pilots and laid it out in his famously blunt style. From now on, we're hunting. We find them, we fight them, we kill them. The best way to keep them off the bombers is to shoot them down over their own damn airfields. For these men, the change was a liberation. They were no longer bodyguards. They were predators. The psychological shift was immense. They were seizing the initiative, and they were hungry for the kill. But in the bomber group briefing rooms, the mood was funereal. The crews saw the order as a death sentence. The sight of their little friends, the escort fighters tucked in close, was a profound psychological comfort. It was the visual proof that they were not alone in the vast hostile sky. Now they were being told that their guardians would be flying 50 miles ahead out of sight, chasing Germans on their own terms. It felt like abandonment. Lieutenant John C. Morgan, a B-17 co-pilot and Medal of Honor recipient, recalled the sentiment, "We thought Doolittle was insane. He was a fighter pilot. He didn't understand our war. We believed we were being sacrificed, used as bait to draw the Luftwaffe up for the fighters to kill. And we were right. That's exactly what we were. It was just a question of whether the strategy would work before we all got killed." The conflict was stark. The fighter pilots saw the strategic brilliance. Killing the archer is better than swatting his arrows. The bomber crews saw the immediate terrifying reality. They were the target, and their shields were being taken away. Even within the high command, there was deep skepticism. Bomber generals who had built their careers on the doctrine of self-defense saw Doolittle's order as a reckless gamble that risked the entire strategic bombing campaign on a fighter pilot's aggressive whim. They feared a repeat of Black Thursday, but worse. Doolittle was staking everything, thousands of lives, and the future of the air war on his conviction that offense was the only true defense. The stage was set for one of the most audacious experiments in the history of warfare. The next few weeks would provide the answer. It would either be remembered as Doolittle's folly, a mistake that cost thousands of lives, or Doolittle's gambit, the stroke of genius that won the war in the air. The weather over northern Europe in January 1944 was, as usual, abysmal. A thick blanket of cloud and freezing fog kept the heavy bombers on the ground for days, delaying the first true test of Doolittle's new strategy. But on January 11th, a break in the weather allowed the 8th to launch a major strike against aircraft factories in central Germany. This time, as the bomber stream crossed into enemy territory, something was different. Instead of a tight cluster of fighters, the P-51 Mustangs of the 354th Fighter Group pushed their throttles forward and surged ahead, climbing and fanning out their pilots' eyes, scanning the cold, empty sky. They were hunting. Leading one of the squadrons was Major James H. Howard. Flying 50 miles ahead of the lead bomber box, his flight spotted them first. More than 30 twin-engine Messerschmitt Bischoff 110 Zerstör destroyers, laboriously forming up their fuselages pregnant with the heavy air-to-air rockets they used to devastate bomber formations. Under the old rules, Howard would have reported the contact and waited for them to approach the bombers. Under the new rules, he was free to kill. Tally-ho! Let's get 'em, boys! Howard's voice crackled over the radio. The four Mustangs rolled over and plunged down the whine of their Merlins, rising to a scream. The German pilots were caught completely by surprise. Their attention was focused on the bomber stream, still a tiny speck on the horizon. They were in their own backyard, assembling for an attack at their leisure. They never imagined American fighters would be here this deep, this early. Howard's P-51 slammed into the formation like a hawk into a flock of pigeons. His 450 caliber machine guns tore a Bf-110 apart in a single, precise burst. The massive German fighter simply disintegrated its rocket payload, detonating in a brilliant orange fireball. The German formation, a disciplined unit, moments before shattered into panic-scattering individuals. The Mustangs tore through them, their superior speed and maneuverability a terrifying revelation. For the next 20 minutes, Howard and his men engaged in a running battle, shooting down 3 more of the heavy fighters and scattering the rest so completely that they never regrouped to threaten the bombers. When Howard finally rendezvoused with the B-17 seconds, the bomber crews were just beginning to see the first signs of German opposition, and it was already in chaos, fighting for its life against an enemy that had struck from nowhere. The psychological impact on the German pilots was profound. Their safe assembly areas were no longer safe. The predictable rhythm of their interception missions had been broken. The Americans were no longer playing by the rules. For the bomber crews, the effect was equally startling. The massive, coordinated waves of attackers they had come to dread simply didn't materialize. They still fought, but against smaller, disorganized groups that were harried and already bloodied by the time they reached the bombers. That single engagement was a microcosm of the new reality. By taking the fight to the enemy, Howard's small flight had neutralized a force 10 times its size before it could ever become a threat. It was a stunning validation of Doolittle's theory, but this was just a skirmish. Doolittle and Spots were planning something far larger, a deliberate week-long campaign designed to force the entire Luftwaffe into the sky for a battle of annihilation from which there would be no retreat. They were about to kick over the hornet's nest, and they were counting on their new wolves to devour the swarm. By mid-February 1944, all the pieces were in place. The P-51 Mustang was arriving in theater in ever-increasing numbers. The fighter pilots were trained, bloodied, and straining at the leash. Doolittle's aggressive doctrine was now the law of the land. Now General Carl Toohey Spots, the overall commander of U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, was ready to play his hand. He and Doolittle conceived a plan of such audacious scale it bordered on the Napoleonic. It was codenamed Operation Argument, but the men who flew it would come to know it simply as Big Week. The strategy was a masterpiece of military calculation, a brutal application of logic that turned the Luftwaffe's greatest strength, its need to defend the homeland, into its fatal weakness. The plan was not at its core about destroying factories. It was about destroying pilots. Spots and Doolittle selected a list of targets so critical to German fighter production assembly plants in Leipzig, Gotha, Regensburg, and others that the Luftwaffe High Command would have no choice but to send every available fighter into the sky to defend them. For days on end, the 8th Air Force from England and the 15th Air Force from Italy would hurl more than 1,000 bombers a day at these targets. They were dangling the most precious bait imaginable, and they knew the Germans would have to take it. The bomber streams were the anvil. Doolittle's newly unleashed fighters would be the hammer. The goal was to force the Luftwaffe's veteran experten into a sustained week-long battle of attrition they could not possibly win. The tension in the briefing huts across England on the night of February 19th was electric. The weather, which had socked in the continent for weeks, was finally clearing. The crews were told this was it, the big one. Maps were unveiled, showing routes that stretched deep into the heart of the Reich. The scale was staggering. Over 1,000 heavy bombers, nearly 900 escort fighters. The largest air armada ever assembled in the history of the world was about to launch with the express purpose of picking a fight. There was a cold, hard calculus at the heart of Big Week that went unsaid in the briefings, but was understood by all. Men would die. Many of them. Bombers would be lost. But those losses were acceptable because the American war machine could replace them. Every B-17 loss could be replaced by 3 more rolling off the lines in Seattle. Every crewman loss, tragic as it was, could be replaced by the thousands graduating from flight schools back home. But every veteran German pilot shot down was a loss the Luftwaffe could never recover. It was a cold, cruel, industrial-age strategy. America was going to leverage its greatest asset, its limitless production capacity, to destroy Germany's most finite resource, its skilled men. As the engines of 1,000 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds roared to life in the pre-dawn darkness of February 20th, a new chapter in the air war was beginning. This was no longer about bombing targets. It was about exterminating an entire air force. The sky over central Germany on February 20th, 1944, was not a battlefield. It was a multi-layered universe of controlled chaos. At 2,500 feet, the bombers droned on a river of silver aluminum, leaving thick white contrails that stretched for 100 miles. Below, above, and far ahead, the fighters danced their deadly ballet. This was not the orderly head-on pass of 1943. This was a swirling, three-dimensional melee, a war of individuals and small flights spread across thousands of cubic miles of airspace. From the cockpit of his P-51, Lieutenant Clarence "Bud" Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group saw the German response climbing to meet them. It was a testament to the Luftwaffe's courage, wave after wave of Bf-109 seconds and W-190 seconds clawing for altitude, determined to break through to the bombers. But now Anderson wasn't waiting. He and his squadron dove on the Germans from 3,000 feet, their Merlins screaming, plunging into the enemy formation before it could even get organized. "I picked out a 109 inches of steep climb," Anderson recalled in his combat report. "He never saw me coming. I opened up from 400 yards, a short burst. Pieces flew off his left wing, and he just snapped over into a spin. There was no time to watch him go down. There were 3 more on my tail." The battle dissolved into a series of desperate, twisting dogfights. A German pilot would dive on a Mustang, only to have another Mustang dive on him. The air was filled with the chatter of guns, the flash of exploding cannon shells, and the stark, beautiful, terrifying sight of a burning plane tumbling from the stratosphere. Inside the B-17 Argyll Sal, the crew could only watch in awe and terror. Staff Sergeant Ben Kuroki, a Japanese-American waist gunner, saw the battle unfold. It was like watching a movie, except it was real. We'd see a pack of Mustangs tear into a bunch of Jerrys 50 miles ahead. We'd see the contrails tangle up, then 1 or 2 would just fall away, trailing smoke. By the time we got to that patch of sky, the fight was over, and the Mustangs were gone, hunting for more. For the first time, the bomber crews felt like they were part of a team, not just the bait. The fighters weren't just protecting them, they were clearing a path for them through a storm of enemy steel. For the German pilots, it was a nightmare. They had trained to attack slow, predictable bomber formations. They were now being forced to fight for their lives against superior aircraft that held every advantage of speed, altitude, and surprise. Major Georg Peter Eder, a veteran German ace, described the feeling we could not assemble. We would try to form up, and they would be upon us. We would dive to escape, and they would dive faster. We would climb, and they would be waiting above us. Everywhere we turned, there were Mustangs. It was not a battle, it was a hunt, and we were the prey. For 5 brutal days, this scene was repeated across Germany. Each raid brought the same ferocious response, and each response cost the Luftwaffe dearly. The factories were being hit, yes, but the real damage was being done at 3,000 feet. The hammer of the American fighter force was methodically smashing the anvil of the Luftwaffe, and with every blow, the German sword was cracking its finest steel, shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. When the clouds rolled back in over Germany on February 25th, bringing an end to Big Week, the commanders on both sides began to tally the cost. The numbers when they were finalized were staggering, and they told a story of brutal but effective attrition. The 8th and 15th Air Forces had lost a combined 226 heavy bombers and 28 fighters. Over 2,600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. In the press, these were reported as acceptable losses, a testament to the cold arithmetic of war. Each loss was a tragedy, a family shattered back home, but in the grand strategic picture, these were numbers the American war machine could absorb without flinching. The production lines in Wichita and Seattle would replace the planes in a matter of weeks. The training bases in Texas and Arizona would graduate thousands of new crews to fill the empty bunks. But for the Luftwaffe, the butcher's bill was not just heavy, it was fatal. They had lost over 355 fighters in the air, with hundreds more damaged on the ground. But the truly catastrophic figure was the loss of nearly 100 of their most experienced fighter pilots, killed in action, with another 50 so badly wounded they would never fly again. These were not the green recruits from the training schools. These were the squadron and group leaders, the aces, with scores in the dozens, the men who held the fragile German fighter force together. Men like Hauptmann, Adalbert, Ohlmüller, and Ace, with 92 victories shot down and killed over Leipzig. Or Major Heinz Behr, who survived but was wounded, taking him out of action for weeks. These were men who could not be replaced. In his office, Adolf Galland looked at the reports and felt a cold dread. His experten were being systematically exterminated. He had thrown his best against the Americans, and his best had been broken. The American fighters had not just fought well, they had fought with a relentless predatory aggression that his new undertrained pilots could not counter. The Americans had dictated the terms of the entire week-long battle, and the Luftwaffe had been forced to react bleeding, precious lifeblood with every sortie. Galland knew with the certainty of a seasoned commander that he had just lost the air war. He wrote a grim report to Reichsmarschall Göring. The enemy has succeeded in his goal. Our fighter arm has been dealt a blow from which it will not recover. We have lost the core of our experienced leadership. In the future, we will be able to offer only token resistance. The psychological impact rippled through the German squadrons. The myth of their invincibility was shattered. The American P-51, the Jabos as they called them, was now the most feared aircraft in the sky. German pilots who once eagerly sought combat now flew with a sense of fatalism. They knew that somewhere above them or far ahead of them, the American wolves were circling, waiting. The defensive shield over the Reich had been cracked. But Doolittle was not finished. He had broken the Luftwaffe in the air. Now he intended to ensure they could find no safety, not even on the ground. The second phase of his order was about to be unleashed with devastating effect. The terror for the Luftwaffe no longer ended when a pilot landed his aircraft. In fact, it often began. Doolittle's directive had a second viciously effective clause. After escorting the bombers to the target, if fuel permitted, the fighters were free to drop down to the deck and hunt. This transformed every returning fighter group into a marauding band of destroyers, turning the German countryside into a free-fire zone. The primary targets were the Luftwaffe's own airfields. The effect was psychologically and materially devastating. After surviving a harrowing high-altitude battle, a German pilot would descend toward his home base, exhausted and low on fuel, only to find it under attack by swarms of American fighters. The scenes were ones of pure chaos. P-51 seconds and P-47 seconds would come in at treetop level, their 50-caliber machine guns ripping through everything in their path. A Messerschmitt being refueled would erupt in a ball of flame. A line of parked aircraft waiting for maintenance would be shredded into Swiss cheese. Hangars would be strafed until they collapsed. Most terrifyingly for the pilots, they had to land in the middle of this chaos. They would drop their landing gear and make their final approach, praying that a Mustang wouldn't latch onto their tail in their most vulnerable state. Many died within sight of their own runway. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a German ace, described the experience. There was no sanctuary. We would fight for 2 hours at high altitude, then have to fight our way onto our own airfield. The Americans were like angry bees. They were everywhere. We would see the smoke from our base from miles away and know they were there waiting. Morale collapsed. How can you fight when you are not even safe at home? These low-level sweeps, or rhubarbs as the pilots called them, did more than just destroy aircraft. They sowed chaos throughout the entire German rear area. Nothing that moved was safe. A train carrying critical supplies would be strafed its locomotive, exploding in a cloud of steam, blocking the line for days. A staff car carrying an important officer would be shot off the road. A fuel truck convoy, a target of highest priority, would be turned into a chain of pyres. The American pilots became masters of this low-level destruction. They flew with a swaggering confidence, their kill markings now including not just crosses for aircraft, but also silhouettes of trains, trucks, and tanks. This campaign of systematic ground attack had a critical effect. It strangled the Luftwaffe. Even if a fighter survived combat, it might be destroyed on the ground. Even if an airfield was not attacked directly, its fuel and ammunition might be destroyed en route. The entire logistical chain that supported the German fighter arm was being dismembered piece by piece. Doolittle had understood that to kill an air force, you couldn't just kill its pilots in the air, you had to destroy its nest on the ground. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting a two-front war on its own territory. One at 30,000 feet and another at 30 feet. They were losing decisively on both. And this absolute dominance in the air was about to enable the most ambitious military operation in human history. June 6, 1944, as the largest amphibious force ever assembled approached the beaches of Normandy, the men huddled in the landing craft looked anxiously towards the sky. They had been told they would have air cover, but years of Nazi propaganda had filled their minds with images of the mighty Luftwaffe. They expected a sky black with German fighters, a hornet's nest of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving down to strafe and bomb them on the beaches. But as the dawn broke, the sky was filled with aircraft, all of them bearing the white star of the Allies. The sky was theirs. On that single decisive day, the Allied air forces flew over 1,4,000 sorties over the invasion area. The Luftwaffe, in stark contrast, managed to fly fewer than 300, and most of those were scattered ineffective and quickly swept from the sky. The complete and total air supremacy that the Allies enjoyed on D-Day was not an accident. It was the direct, hard-won result of Jimmy Doolittle's strategy, executed with brutal efficiency in the bloody skies over Germany in the preceding 5 months. The pilots who should have been strafing the beaches of Normandy were already dead. The planes that should have been bombing the invasion fleet were burning wrecks on airfields from France to Germany. The fuel that should have powered the German response had been incinerated in countless burning trucks and trains. The German commanders on the ground were paralyzed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with defending Fortress Europe, had pleaded for months for more air support, knowing that an invasion could not be stopped without it. On D-Day, his worst fears were realized. He wrote in his diary, his words a testament to the success of the Allied air campaign, "The enemy's air superiority is total. It is impossible to move our reserves to the front during the day. Every road is under attack. Our panzer divisions are being destroyed by fighter bombers before they can even reach the battle. We are being defeated from the air." The soldiers on the ground experienced this reality firsthand. When a German Tiger tank or an 88mm gun position opened fire, a call would go out for air support. Within minutes, P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons would appear diving down with rockets and bombs, acting as a form of flying artillery that could precisely eliminate any threat. The German soldier was trapped. If he moved, he was seen and killed. If he stayed put, he was bombed into oblivion. The great battle for France was being decided not just by the infantrymen in the hedgerows, but by the fighter pilots who had won the war in the air months before the first boot touched the sand. The silent skies over Normandy were the ultimate vindication of Doolittle's gamble. The bomber crews, who had once felt abandoned, now understood. The best way to protect the soldiers on the beach was not to circle over their heads, but to have killed the enemy months ago, hundreds of miles away. Air supremacy was not a defensive shield, it was an offensive sword that had gutted the enemy long before the main battle began. The Luftwaffe was a ghost, a phantom force that existed on paper but could no longer influence the course of the war. But even as a ghost, it had one last terrifying trick up its sleeve. Even as the Luftwaffe was collapsing, German science was providing it with a potential savior. In the summer of 1944, American pilots began reporting encounters with a new type of enemy aircraft, something that moved with impossible speed and made no sound until it was already past them. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had arrived. With a top speed of over 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51, the Me-262 should have been an untouchable war winner. In a straight and level fight, no propeller-driven aircraft could catch it. Its 4 30mm cannons could obliterate a B-17 with a single devastating burst. For a brief moment, it seemed the Germans might have found a miracle weapon to reverse the tide. But the Me-262 was a flawed miracle. Its Junkers Jumo 004 jet engines were notoriously unreliable, prone to flaming out, and had a service life of only 10 to 25 hours. The jet was also vulnerable. It accelerated slowly and was a sitting duck during its long takeoff runs and landing approaches. Doolittle's Wolves, now the undisputed masters of the sky, did not panic. They adapted. They learned the jet's weaknesses and exploited them with the ruthless efficiency they had perfected over months of combat. Fighter groups began setting up standing patrols over known Me-262 airfields, waiting for the jets to take off or land. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. The experience and tactical flexibility of the American pilots proved more valuable than the raw speed of the German jets. On November 2, 1944, Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group was leading a flight of P-51 seconds near Akmer Airfield when he spotted two Mi-262 seconds taking off. He rolled his Mustang into a dive from 15000 feet, pushing his Merlin engine to its absolute limit. He ignored the hail of anti-aircraft fire from the ground and closed in on the first jet as it was retracting its landing gear. A precise burst from his .50 calibers tore into its engine, and the jet exploded. He then pulled up hard, sighted the second jet, and shot it down as well. 2 jet kills in less than a minute. Even in the air, the jets were not invincible. The Americans learned to use their superior numbers and tactical discipline. A flight of Mustangs couldn't catch a jet, but they could position themselves to force the jet pilot into a defensive turn, which made him bleed off his precious speed advantage. Or they could use their own high-speed dive capability to ambush the jets from above. The final statistics tell the story. While the Mi-262 seconds shot down approximately 542 Allied aircraft, over 100 jets were lost in combat and hundreds more were destroyed on the ground in accidents or due to engine failure. It was a technologically brilliant weapon that arrived too late in too few numbers and was flown by pilots who lacked the training and experience to use it effectively against the seasoned veterans of the 8th Air Force. The air war over Europe ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. The Luftwaffe's last gasp of technological superiority, snuffed out by the overwhelming combat proficiency of the men Jimmy Doolittle had unleashed. In the end, it all comes back to that sign on the wall. The simple piece of painted wood that Doolittle ordered taken down represented more than just a tactical doctrine. It represented a state of mind. It was the mindset of a command that saw itself as a victim, a force that had to defend and endure. The new sign, the first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters, represented a new philosophy. It was the mindset of a predator, a force that would seek out and annihilate its enemy, that would dictate the terms of battle and win through relentless, violent aggression. This transformation, engineered by one man's clarity of vision, was the single most decisive factor in the Allied victory in the air war over Europe. The numbers are a testament to its success. In the 5 months following Doolittle's order from January to the end of May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,500 fighter pilots killed or wounded in the defense of the Reich. They lost the war not because they ran out of airplanes. German industry produced fighters at a record rate in 1944, but because they ran out of men who knew how to fly them in combat. They were bled white systematically by an enemy that had finally learned how to fight. General Galland, in his post-war memoirs, pinpointed the moment of defeat with chilling accuracy, when the Americans began to fly the Mustang in great numbers and freed their fighters from their defensive role. The death knell of the Luftwaffe was sounded. It was the beginning of the end. The bomber crews who had once feared Doolittle's strategy as abandonment became its greatest beneficiaries. Their loss rates, which had been catastrophically unsustainable in 1943, plummeted. The sky had been cleared for them. They could now fly their missions with a degree of safety that would have seemed an impossible fantasy just months earlier. The best defense, as it turned out, truly was a good offense. Jimmy Doolittle's gambit had paid off in a way that exceeded even his own expectations. He had taken command of a force that was losing, and through a single revolutionary idea, turned it into the most dominant air superiority weapon the world had ever seen. The story of the 8th Air Force in 1944 is more than a story of machines and tactics. It is a story about the power of an idea. It demonstrates that courage and sacrifice are not enough. They must be guided by a winning strategy. It proves that in the calculus of war, the willingness to challenge doctrine, to adapt, to embrace ruthless offensive action is the ultimate weapon. The bombers came home alive not because the fighters stayed with them, but because the fighters went out and killed everything that could have harmed them. That simple, brutal, counterintuitive truth, born in a quiet office in England on a cold January day, won the war in the air and sealed the fate of the Third Reich.